Summit Therapeutics missed consensus hard this morning. We're looking at their Q1 2026 numbers, and net loss came in at 24 cents a share, which is a $189.4 million loss for the quarter.
Yeah, and that is a massive widening from the $62.9 million loss we saw in the exact same quarter last year.
Exactly. And look, since they are a pre-revenue biotech, revenue is obviously zero, but total GAAP operating expenses essentially tripled. I mean, they surged from 66.8 million up to 195.2 million.
Right, which is why the stock is seeing some serious volatility right now. The market is really trying to digest this.
Because despite the company sitting on nearly $600 million in cash and short-term investments, management just issued a formal going concern warning in their 10Q filing.
Yeah, that is the headline right there.
So today's deep dive is zeroing in on this exact dynamic. We are unpacking Summit's Q1 2026 earnings release and that official 10Q to figure out how a pre-revenue biopharmaceutical company navigates this high-wire act.
It really is a balancing act, weighing highly anticipated clinical data against a ticking financial clock.
Analyzing this company is honestly like looking at the blueprints for a state-of-the-art rocket while simultaneously tapping the gauge to see if there is actually enough fuel to reach orbit.
That is the perfect way to frame it, because the financials you just outlined, they tell the definitive story of a late-stage biotech. For a company at this phase, the balance sheet absolutely dictates the timeline for survival.
Right.
$195 million quarterly operating expense, that jumps right off the page. But we have to dissect what actually makes up that number.
Because it's not all cash, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you dig into the footnotes in the 10Q, you quickly realize a significant portion of that leap is driven by accounting rules, not actual cash leaving the building.
Let's break that down for everyone listening. The filing specifically cites a $61.7 million stock-based compensation expense.
Right.
And it mentions a Type 3 modification that took certain performance-based stock options from improbable to probable. What does that actually mean in plain English for the company's bottom line?
So in plain English, Summit previously granted stock options to employees that were tied to very specific performance goals, like maybe hitting a certain clinical milestone or a revenue target on a strict timeline.
Okay.
As time went on, the company realized those original goals were unlikely to be met in that required time frame, which makes the options improbable to vest under accounting rules.
Meaning the employees wouldn't get them?
Right. So to retain their top talent, management modified the rules. They stripped away those performance requirements. Now, these options vest simply if the employee continues working at the company. Just a standard service-based requirement.
Got it.
But the moment you change that requirement, accounting standards dictate those options are now probable to vest. So the company must immediately recognize the financial expense of those options on the income statement.
So that $61.7 million is really just a paper expense.
Exactly.
It's a reality of corporate accounting, sure, but it is not 61 million physical dollars being wired out of Summit's bank accounts today.
That distinction is vital. However, we do need to look at the actual cash. Even when we strip away the stock-based comp and look strictly at the non-GAAP research and development expenses, the actual cash funding the science, the financial burn rate is still accelerating dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. Non-GAAP R&D went from 47.1 million in Q1 of last year to 108.2 million in Q1 2026. Basically doubled.
Yeah, and that cash burn is purely being driven by the initiation and the massive expansion of their clinical trials.
But this brings me back to that $598.7 million in cash and short-term investments they reported. To the average investor, $600 million sounds like a massive war chest.
It does.
So why is there a formal going concern warning in this 10Q stating they can't fund operations for the next 12 months?
Because a $600 million war chest is massive in almost any other sector. But in late-stage oncology, it's merely fuel for the furnace. The 10Q really outlines the brutal, unyielding economics of Phase 3 trials.
Just astronomical costs?
Summit spent over $54 million this quarter alone, just on third-party clinical trial-related expenses. That is, paying the contract research organizations that actually run the trials at hospitals all around the world.
Wow.
And they spent another $28 million just on manufacturing the physical clinical trial materials.
Right, because biologics are expensive to make.
Exactly. When you are running multi-regional trials involving thousands of cancer patients, requiring constant monitoring, massive data collection, and highly complex manufacturing, that $600 million gets drawn down rapidly.
Which triggers the going concern warning because accounting rules require auditors to project the current cash burn forward 12 months. If the math shows the bank account hitting zero before that year is up, the company is legally obligated to warn investors.
Exactly. It's a standard regulatory requirement, but it frames the entire investment thesis. Until a biotech company secures regulatory approval and starts generating commercial revenue, their cash is just a countdown timer. The filing is very transparent that they will need to raise additional capital via equity, debt, or strategic partnerships.
So we know exactly how more cash they are burning. Now we need to look at what they are actually spending it on. We have to understand the core asset that justifies this entire $195 million quarter,
Right. Ivonescimab.
also known as SMT-112.
Right. So ivonescimab is an investigational, potentially first-in-class bispecific antibody. And to understand why Summit is burning over $100 million a quarter on this, you really have to grasp the fundamental architecture of the drug.
Let me set this up with an analogy. Because most targeted cancer therapies just do one thing, like a PD-1 inhibitor unmasks the tumor so the patient's own immune system can see it and attack it.
Right.
But a VEGF inhibitor, on the other hand, attacks the tumor's infrastructure. It starves it of the blood supply it needs to grow. Historically, if a doctor wanted to do both of those things, they had to send two separate platoons into battle. Two completely different drugs put into the patient's body.
And delivering two separate systemic drugs often really compounds the toxic side effects for the patient. But ivonescimab is a single elite special ops unit. It is specifically engineered to do both of those jobs at the exact same time within a single molecule. The filings detail that the drug has a tetravalent structure.
Standard antibodies are bivalent, right?
Right. They have two arms to grab onto targets. Ivonescimab has 4 binding sites.
And the filing mentions that this tetravalent structure creates higher avidity, which, if we translate that for you, avidity is essentially the accumulated strength of multiple binding interactions.
Yeah.
It's the difference between trying to hold onto a cliff face with 2 fingers versus grabbing it with your entire hand. You just get a much tighter, more secure grip.
That is a great way to picture it.
But the text highlights another specific design advantage called cooperative binding, and I want to dive into the mechanism here. What is cooperative binding?
Cooperative binding is really the critical differentiator for this drug, because one of the biggest challenges in oncology is hitting the tumor without causing massive collateral damage to the rest of the patient's healthy tissue. Ivonescimab is designed to display a multifold higher affinity, like a stronger magnetic attraction, to the PD-1 target, specifically when the VEGF target is also present.
So going back to the special ops analogy, instead of a generic unit, it's more like a biological safety deposit box that requires 2 completely different keys to be turned at the exact same time to fully open.
Yes, exactly.
One key is the presence of PD-1, the other is VEGF. The drug only unlocks and hyper-focuses its attack when it sees both of those red flags simultaneously.
That safety deposit box analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanism and the place in the human body where you find a high expression of both PD-1 and VEGF at the same time is the tumor microenvironment.
The TME.
Right, the TME. Tumors are incredibly greedy. They aggressively pump out VEGF to build new blood vessels and feed themselves while simultaneously using PD-1 to hide from the immune system.
Wow. Okay.
So ivonescimab's cooperative binding uses that exact dynamic as a homing beacon. It directs the drug to accumulate within the tumor microenvironment, aiming to improve efficacy while theoretically sparing healthy tissue from those severe side effects of dual therapy.
And we aren't just talking about a theory in a petri dish here. The scale of the data they have already collected is staggering.
It really is.
The 10Q notes that over 4,000 patients have been treated globally in clinical trials. And furthermore, their partner company in China, Akeso, has treated over 70,000 patients in the commercial setting.
Right, which is huge. When you are looking at the safety profile of a novel molecule, having tens of thousands of human data points is an incredible de-risking factor. Having 70,000 real-world patients provides a massive database for safety and tolerability that most pre-revenue biotechs simply do not possess.
Let's talk about that partnership really quick. Who owns what here?
So Summit originally struck a licensing agreement with Akeso back in early 2023. That was for the rights to develop and commercialize ivonescimab in North America, South America, Europe, and Japan. Then, in late 2024, the 10Q shows Summit actually expanded their territory. They paid a $15 million upfront payment to add the Middle East and Africa to their license.
So Summit effectively secured the rights to the most lucrative pharmaceutical markets in the West and emerging regions.
Yeah, well, Akeso retains the development and commercialization rights for the rest of the world, most notably China, where the drug is obviously already approved and generating revenue.
And Summit is obligated to pay Akeso royalties on net sales and certain milestone payments if the drug clears regulatory hurdles in Summit's territories.
Correct.
Okay, so we understand the drug's mechanics and we understand the massive cash burn required to run these trials. The natural next question is the timeline. When do we actually find out if this drug makes it to market?
We need to look at the near-term catalysts. The most critical date circled on Summit's calendar right now is November 14, 2026.
Okay.
That is the FDA's PDUFA goal date for their biologics license application, or BLA.
Let me translate the alphabet soup of that specific application for you. Summit is seeking FDA approval for ivonescimab combined with chemotherapy for a very specific high-need population.
Very specific.
It's for patients with epidermal growth factor receptor, or EGFR mutated, locally advanced, or metastatic non-squamous, non-small cell lung cancer, who have previously been treated with a third-generation EGFR tyrosine kinase inhibitor.
I know that is a mouthful, but to understand why this population is so important, you have to look at the biology. EGFR is a mutation that basically causes cancer cells to divide rapidly.
Right.
And non-squamous refers to the type of cells in the outer part of the lungs where the tumor actually originates. For a long time, targeted pills called tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or TKIs, were the absolute miracle drug for this mutation.
Now the cancer adapts.
Exactly. Eventually, the tumor outsmarts the drug. Once a patient's cancer develops resistance to a third-generation TKI, their options are severely limited. The cancer is aggressive at that point, and standard chemotherapy is often all that is left.
This is the exact patient population being studied in Summit's Harmony trial. But there is a massive risk factor buried right in this filing regarding that November PDUFA date.
Yeah, there is.
The FDA explicitly informed Summit that to get marketing approval in this setting, the company must show a statistically significant overall survival benefit, or OS.
Right. In oncology trials, there are usually two main primary endpoints: progression-free survival, or PFS, which measures how long a patient lives with the disease without the tumor getting visibly worse on a scan.
Okay.
And then overall survival, or OS, which measures exactly what it sounds like, how long the patient actually lives from the start of the treatment.
Right. I want to push back on this on behalf of anyone looking at this cash burn.
Sure.
If the drug successfully stops a tumor from growing, which is what progression-free survival measures, the FDA still won't approve it until they wait to see when patients actually pass away. That seems incredibly punishing for a company burning over $100 million a quarter while they wait for that specific data to mature.
It definitely sounds harsh, but the FDA's mandate is strict clinical benefit, not financial convenience for the biotech company.
Fair point.
Progression-free survival is considered a surrogate endpoint.
Yeah.
A drug might successfully shrink a tumor or pause its growth for a few months, sure. But if the toxicity of the drug severely damages the patient's organs in the process, they might not actually live any longer than they would have on standard therapy.
I see.
So the FDA is telling Summit that in this specific lung cancer setting, merely pausing the tumor isn't enough. They demand definitive proof that ivonescimab actually extends human life. That takes significantly more time to prove statistically, which keeps that cash burn clock ticking.
That makes the financial runway even more critical. But speaking of progression-free survival, what about the other variations of these lung cancer trials mentioned in the text? The filing details the Harmony 3 trial, specifically the squamous cohort. It mentions an interim analysis for PFS, where the independent committee recommended continuing the study. Now, if they didn't stop the study early for overwhelming efficacy, should we read that as a failure?
No, absolutely not, though that is a very common misconception in biotech investing. It really comes down to a statistical concept called alpha.
Alpha.
Think of alpha as a strict, predefined budget of allowed statistical errors. It's usually set at 5% for a trial. If you want to take an early peek at the data before the trial is totally finished, you have to spend a portion of that alpha budget.
Okay, that makes sense.
To ensure you don't burn through your entire budget and ruin the statistical integrity of the final analysis, the bar to declare a definitive victory during an early interim look is set incredibly high. Artificially high, really.
So they took an early look. They didn't clear that massive, artificially high hurdle, but they also didn't see anything wrong.
Exactly. The Independent Data Monitoring Committee reviewed the unblinded data. They noted there were absolutely no safety concerns, and they recommended the trial continue to its pre-planned final PFS analysis. Not stopping early isn't a failure, it's just the statistically expected path for a large oncology trial.
And the 10Q confirms there is no change to that timeline. The final PFS data for the Harmony 3 squamous cohort is expected in the second half of 2026.
Yep.
But just prior to that, there is another massive catalyst for you to watch. The filing points heavily to the ASCO 2026 annual meeting.
Oh, ASCO is going to be huge.
On May 31st, a late-breaking abstract will be presented during the plenary session, revealing overall survival data from the Harmony 6 trial. This is a phase 3 study in first-line squamous non-small cell lung cancer being conducted in China by Akeso.
So the data readouts are really accelerating now. And while these lung cancer trials are the main event, the filings reveal Summit is quietly expanding the drug's footprint across other solid tumors to maximize its future commercial value.
Right, expanding the map.
Yeah, and they are doing it using a highly capital-efficient strategy, which is crucial given the cash position.
They have initiated their own sponsored phase 3 program in colorectal cancer with the Harmony GI3 trial. But if you look at the additional development updates section, they're essentially letting other pharmaceutical organizations foot the bill to test ivonescimab in combination with other experimental drugs.
Yes, they highlight a clinical collaboration with Revolution Medicines, or RevMed, evaluating ivonescimab with RevMed's RAS inhibitors.
Right.
KRAS mutations are notorious drivers of aggressive tumors. So combining a drug that targets the RAS pathway with ivonescimab, which handles the immune activation and the blood starvation, is a theoretical triple threat against the cancer.
And they also announced a collaboration with GSK to test it in combination with a novel B7H3 targeted therapy.
Exactly.
But the most fascinating example of this strategy in the filing is the February 2026 collaboration with Gortec in Europe.
Yeah, Gortec is a highly respected European cooperative group dedicated entirely to head and neck oncology. They're sponsoring a massive 780-patient phase 3 trial called Illumin.
Wow, 780 patients.
It is a 3-arm study evaluating ivonescimab specifically against head and neck squamous cell carcinoma.
Why head and neck cancer specifically?
Head and neck tumors are notoriously highly vascularized, meaning they rely heavily on robust blood vessel networks to grow, and they are also deeply immune suppressed.
Making them a perfect target.
Right, that makes them a textbook biological target for a drug that simultaneously blocks VEGF and PD-1.
And because Gortec is sponsoring the trial, Summit gets access to the clinical data from those 780 patients.
Yes.
The 10Q explicitly states Summit may consider expanding this study into the United States. They essentially get a front row seat to a massive phase 3 trial without paying that brutal $50 million a quarter phase 3 price tag we broke down earlier.
Exactly. It preserves that precious $598 million cash pile while simultaneously taking shots on goal in entirely new tumor types. It really is a masterclass in pipeline expansion. You leverage your partner's capital to generate the data, and if the data is positive, you use it to file for label expansions in your own lucrative territory.
So to pull all of this together for you, Summit Therapeutics reported a significant Q1 net loss and widening operating expenses, triggering a formal going concern warning.
Right.
However, they are sitting on a specifically engineered bispecific antibody with massive commercial and clinical validation already occurring in China. They are trapped in a high-stakes race against time and their own balance sheet to secure a U.S. FDA approval before that $598 million bank account runs out.
It's going to be a wild ride. And as we look toward that critical November 14, 2026 PDUFA date, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, entirely drawn from the dynamics laid out in this 10Q.
Let's hear.
The filing makes it abundantly clear that several of the major studies generating data right now, like the upcoming ASCO presentation for Harmony 6 or the previously positive Harmony and Harmony 2 trials, they are single-region phase 3 trials conducted exclusively in China, sponsored and analyzed entirely by Akeso.
And at the exact same time, the U.S. FDA has explicitly told Summit that they require strict overall survival benefits for marketing approval.
Right. This raises a massive regulatory question for you to think about. How will the U.S. FDA evaluate and weigh clinical data that is predominantly sourced from a single non-U.S. region when making a decision of this magnitude?
That's a great point.
The FDA has historically scrutinized data packages that do not reflect the diversity of the U.S. patient population. So will the FDA accept the Chinese overall survival data at face value to support a U.S. approval, or will they demand more domestic data from Summit's ongoing global trials?
And if they demand more domestic data, that resets the clock and the cash burn just continues. This geopolitical and regulatory tension isn't just a footnote in the 10Q. It is the ultimate unpriced wildcard for Summit's future. Keep questioning the numbers and make sure you follow the show for our daily earnings coverage.